If we could go ahead and ask everybody to take their seats. It is 9 a.m. on the dot, and in tradition, we are always on time, and we will try to end early, too. So how's that? I want to welcome everybody to the June 26, 2015 meeting of the California Road Charge Pilot Technical Advisory Committee. And thank everybody for being here. We'll start first with our roll call, and we'll go to Ann Johnson.
Senator Jim Bell. David Finnegan.
Here.
Steve Finnegan. Lisa Bartlett. Here.
Thank you very much, and we do have a quorum, so thank you, Ann, for that. Before we get into the formalities, I'd like to recognize Komei Ajisi, who is the Chief Deputy Director for Caltrans. Maybe he'd like to say a few words. Komei.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. It used to be an auditorium with theater seats and a stage over here that actually used to be where the early incarnation of the CTC met. And stories have it that we have an elevator behind here that actually went up to the director's meeting. So the director could stop the CTC meeting in those days if he was upset. He would just go in his elevator. That doesn't happen anymore. No. Anyhow, we spent some time putting this together, and I'm glad that you get to use it today, and it's a privilege to have you here. I would just want to say that the work you're doing, without being corny, I think it's God's work on behalf of the people of California. So we're looking forward to what comes out of this process with great anticipation, knowing that we've been having multiple conversations about transportation funding, and there is a consensus that's sort of formed that we do in fact need funding for infrastructure in California after all. So the work that you're doing, my sense is will be instrumental in taking us forward and looking in terms of identifying what the next step's going to be for funding infrastructure in California. Again, I just want to welcome you, and I appreciate the chance to have met you. In fact, I was just telling Professor Wax that it's for me, it's a unique honor to be in any room with him. I'm going to embarrass him because he's my hero, and I think I could say I plagiarized, or maybe I used extensively the works that he had done in planning when I was working on my graduate program at Fresno State. So it's good to be in the presence of greatness around here, and you all can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Komei. We feel the same way having Professor Wax on this technical advisory committee, and I just want to say to you how happy we are with all of the Caltrans team who, from Norma Ortega on down, who have been supporting our efforts. As you say, we are looking at something that may be 5-10 years out, but it is likely the future of transportation funding, not only for the state, but more than likely the United States. And I think we're all mindful of what we are doing here. But again, thank you for all that your team has provided us in terms of its guidance and leadership. They've been outstanding. Yes, we are. Yeah. Thank you very much, Komei. We've got a real full agenda today with a number of items, including an interactive discussion on the design parameters and the criteria for the California Road Charge Pilot Program. Before we get into that, I want to recognize that Councilmember Pam O'Connor has...
Trying to turn her phone off.
It's a kind of a nice ring, though. Listen to that. I'd like to recognize her for the record that she is present. And for logistics, let me turn it over to the CTC Executive Director, Will Kempton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, we know the room's a little crowded. As Comey indicated, it's an historical piece of this building, and so it's nice to have the meeting here today, but we'll do the best we can with the capacity limitations. Restrooms for the women are behind me through this door here. Restrooms for the men are out the door and to the right. In terms of evacuation or safety issues, if we need to leave the building, we will just go out that door, up the stairs, and out the N Street exit. Our convention area is over in Capitol Park. Wi-Fi, the username is capital D, capital O, capital T, capital G, small case UEST, and the passcode is lowercase JUN15. And I would like to announce also, Mr. Chairman, for the record, that we have 2 new members today of the CC Riders. That is the Capitol Corridor Rail Service users.
That's right.
And to this morning, members Tien and Mark Antonio and I rode from the Bay Area here to Sacramento. Another perfect trip, on-time performance, precise, and we were here early for the meeting.
It was a fact-finding.
And you've done this more than once together now, I understand.
This is the first time for the 3 of us.
Oh, for the 3 together. Okay. Well, I'm glad it worked out good. Well, thank you very much, Will. Just a few housekeeping items for many of you that have attended these meetings. As you probably know, one of the main purposes for our meetings is to collect public comment and to hear from the public. I see a number of new faces and a number of familiar faces, so welcome to the new faces, and thank you for those that are regularly following our proceedings. There's a couple of spots on the agenda today for public comment under item number 2, which we'll be about to get to, and number 17. But I will tell you, anybody in the audience is free to speak on any of the items on the agenda. Just raise your hand or what have you. There's a blue speaker card. Ann will hold it up. Anybody wants one, please fill it out. Give it to Ann so we can make sure that we know that you are here. And as a further reminder, and I know the committee members know this, if there's things that come up during the day today that are beyond the time that we have or they're not on the agenda, we'll put them in what we call our parking lot. And as you all well know, at this point, I've made sure that anything that comes up along the way, we have included on the agenda just to make sure that those issues can be accommodated and we can discuss them. So with that, on the housekeeping side, let's start with item 2 on the agenda, which is just that, public comment. Are there any members of the public wishing to address the Road Charge Technical Advisory Committee? Seeing none, any members of the committee wish to give any updates on things that they've been in the middle of? It's a quiet group today. Richard.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to appreciate Mr. Kempton's convening of a small group to talk about some of the issues that came up at the end of the last meeting about the matrix of how the sample of participants could be broken out, and I appreciated that discussion and the work that the consultant did on it as well.
Yeah, I would echo that. Again, I think the consultant team has done an outstanding job in really accommodating every issue that you all have raised. And again, if there's something you don't think is happening right, I would trust that you would let me know, so we can make sure that it's taken care of. Just a couple of things that I participated in over the last month. I did several presentations, most recently at SCAG, at the Southern California Association of Governments, their joint policy committee meeting. Talked about what we are doing with the road charge effort. It was about 100 or so elected officials from the LA region that were on the video system all over Southern California, and I got a number of emails from people following that were kind of very pleased to see what this group is doing. So that was good to see from LA. Also, the day before that, Eric had me over at the Highway Policy Committee for the California Trucking Association and spoke to that group and basically put out the call for volunteers as we get toward that point in the pilot. And as we'll talk about that in the matrix today, I told him we're probably going to want anywhere from 300 to 500 volunteers in the trucking quadrant, and it seemed like people were pretty receptive to things. I missed what they said. Yeah, that's usually how it goes, right? We'll let Eric comment on that maybe a little bit later. Also presented to the League of California Cities, San Diego Division, and also the San Diego County Taxpayers Association, which was following this as well, just letting them know what we're up to. So there was a couple of things this past month. Item 3 on the agenda would be the approval of the minutes, which were distributed. And before we get to the minutes, I just want to make sure, because we had a little issue at the last meeting, that everybody got copies of the materials. So this month, staff put together something that I absolutely love, and I would hope you all had it, called an Updated Meeting Materials Index. And the copy I have in front of me was dated June 19th, and it shows for every item things that were distributed. So hopefully you have all of those documents. If not, as we go along, please just holler, and we'll make sure that Ann or somebody on the team gets you that particular document. But again, I want to thank Staff Will for doing an awesome job in making sure that not only do we get all this material well in advance, but it's documented in this index, which I think is important, especially for the public wanting to follow along. So with that, we have the minutes from the meeting of May 29th, which was in beautiful Fresno. Is there a motion for approval of the minutes? All right, we have a motion from Professor Wax. Is there a second? Second, Supervisor Bartlett. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of passing the minutes, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that carries unanimously. Our minutes are approved. I kind of took reports out of order. Any other commentary or anything from TAC committee members? Okay, let's go to Carrie on item 5 on the agenda, and she's going to talk about the schedule revision, which we emailed everybody, but she'll give us the formal update.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make sure we did hand out an updated meeting material matrix this morning, so hopefully you have the most current meeting material information. Also, we have started doing tabs. Let me know if there's anything that we could do to improve this process so you have the material and it's easier for you to understand and find. So agenda item 5 is tab 5. It's the TAC meeting schedule. As we discussed at the last meeting, there was a need to change the September TAC meeting date. Based on the poll of all the TAC members, the revised date of September 16th was identified. Staff has prepared the revised TAC meeting agenda for your consideration and approval. Staff recommends your approval of the revised TAC agenda reflecting the September 16th meeting with a location remaining in the North State. We are in the process of looking for a location in Eureka. This is an action item.
That was going to be my question. Did we settle on a place yet? But that's pending. And yes, this is an action item. Any discussion, or do we have a motion for approval of the updated schedule? Don't all speak at once. Motion by Sowers, second by O'Connor. Any other discussion? All right, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Our updated schedule is approved. All right, let's go next to item 6 on the agenda, and Gary Gutierrez from Caltrans is here, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and ready to tell us about focus groups, surveys, and all the ongoing things he's busy with.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Daffer. Good morning, committee members. I'm pleased to report that there actually have been a few changes that we'd like to keep you apprised of. First of all, Caltrans has arranged to perform all the focus groups in advance of the telephone surveys. Also, I'd like to point out that all the focus groups will be completed by the latter part of July, so we'll still generally be able to remain on our schedule. Our first focus group will be this Sunday in Oakland, And we also had another focus group that was scheduled for Tuesday in Reading. That needs to be rescheduled to the latter part of July due to some scheduling conflicts we had with the facilitator. But that will be pushed out to the latter part of July. I would also like to point out that we've made arrangements to add an additional focus group to better accommodate the Southern California population group. So the focus groups, as we have them set up now, from Northern California down to Southern California, we will be having focus groups in Redding, California, Oakland, California, Fresno, Los Angeles, and San Diego. And that's to better accommodate the entire population of California. Following the focus groups, we do anticipate beginning our telephone surveys immediately after the August TAC meeting. So the telephone surveys will begin right around August 31st and should commence around, or I should say end around, the middle part of September. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Professor?
It was earlier stated that there may be an opportunity for some of us to observe the focus groups from behind a window or the glass. If that is possible, could you send us by email the times and places and how we might do that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because that, with respect to Oakland, that is an opportunity. We have confirmed that we can have as many as 12 observers. The facility, I am not quite clear if there is a hidden, if there is a mirror glass or something.
That's how they work, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they all are that way. So, Marty, I see you as like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain as we watch this. Yeah, that's exactly how I picture you. But, no, in fact, I'm going to be in Oakland on Sunday, along with Deputy Executive Director Susan Branson from CTC to watch that one. And I absolutely, and any of you want to join on Sunday at 2, I believe, right? 2 p.m. And again, this is for members of the Technical Advisory Committee. If you're interested, love to have you join. Eric? Okay, Eric will be there. That'd be great. Okay, Lee. Yeah, it's pretty easy for you. It's right where you are.
Right.
So, no, I think it would be great for you to participate. And as other ones get announced, we'll make sure through Carrie or the staff will notify members of the Technical Advisory Committee. The one that was scheduled for Redwood City or wherever it was.
It was actually Reading.
Reading, pardon me.
Yeah, we've had to reschedule.
I know that you've had to reschedule that, but I appreciate you folks being able to do the focus groups first. I think that'll be very instructive on what we end up writing into the poll.
We totally concur.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on this? This was an information item. Seeing none? All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Let's move to the next item on the agenda, item 7. That's 7? Is that what I'm on? Yeah, 7. Is the road charge work group update. And there is a memo on tab 7 from Executive Director of the CTC, Will Kempton, and I'll ask him to introduce this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. As you know, we have been at work to try to expand the opportunities for public input and engagement in this process, and as a result, even though it's not required by statute, to help the TAC to provide more input to the TAC, we've created what we call a work group, and Ann Mayer, the Executive Director of the Riverside County Transportation Commission, among all of our other duties, has agreed to head this group up and to be a regular participant in your efforts. We have just added 2 new members. Were you going to announce that, Ann? Okay, then I won't say anything. And we have a complete 22-member work group now under the able leadership of Ann Mayer, and thanks for attending today, Ann.
Oh, thank you very much. And some of you may know it's very hard to say no to Will when he asks you to do something for him. So anyway, good morning, Chair Medafra and members of the committee. I'm really glad to be able to be here today. As was mentioned, we have now rounded out the work group and have a full team on board. Bruce Blodgett, the Executive Director of the San Joaquin Farm Bureau, has been added, and Annie Nam, the Goods Movement and Transportation Finance Manager for SCAG, has been added as well. So we're really pleased to have such a great group of technical experts available to be able to help you in your discussions. We did have a work group telephone conference on June 16th. The discussion was rather general in nature in that we all knew that you were going to be having this interactive policy discussion this afternoon, but there were some general comments that were made regarding the items under your consideration today, and there are some comments included in the staff report. You also should have copies of letters received from several of the members of the work group. Caltech sent in a letter talking about the principles of sound tax policy as well as comments on non-mileage-based road charge accommodations. The Farm Bureau has provided comments on administrative costs, impact on out-of-state and private road usage, privacy, as well as input on the types of participants. SCAG has been provided comments mostly focused from a goods movement standpoint and talking about the different kinds of entities or components of the subgroups related to who's included in the pilot. So many of the working group members are here in the audience today to participate and to be watching what you're going to be considering in the interactive exercise. And so with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you again, Ann. And I'd like to ask if every member of the working group doesn't mind standing up and just giving your name and the organization you're with, just so we can recognize you. So we'll start with Kurt. I see Kurt back there.
Hi, I'm Kurt Augustine. I'm with the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers.
Sharon Scherzinger from the Rural Counties Task Force for the 26 rural counties in the state of California.
Thank you, Sharon. Got two for here today, plus everybody watching out in the internet world.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, if I might thank you for coming. You're coming to Riverside on Monday to the Coachella Valley Association of Governments to talk about road charge. So we're delighted that you're out and about in Riverside County. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Ann, I cleared this with the chair that why don't you join us at the table here in the event
You can't leave.
There's any comments that you
I'm not leaving. I'm staying.
in the event that there's any comments that you want to add on the part of the working group.
Just in case you thought you were leaving, we thought we'd have you just sit up
You'll
here.
be closer to a microphone.
Thank you, Ann. And thank you again for your service. Again, as mentioned, Pam and I were both on the last call, and I think it's just really good to see this diversity of industry participants, basically backstopping and giving us additional insight along the way. So I appreciate that. All right, let's move to item 8 on our agenda, which is informational reports, and we'll start with the public input update. And I just want to say before Carrie starts, this is very impressive. You all have this matrix which shows the log of public comments. So, Carrie?
Yes, as the chair mentioned, we have created a matrix for representing the summary of all the comments that we've received to date via email or letter. We responded immediately to each comment received through the same medium received. The matrix identifies sender, organization, and general categories the comments were based on. We will be updating the matrix monthly for submission to the TAC. There are hard copies of the comments included in your briefing book. There's probably a couple additional ones that you received today. They are on the matrix, but we just received them yesterday. And we post all our comments online, and I'd be happy to take any questions or suggestions on how we can improve the process.
Does anybody wish to comment on any of the documents? I like how you have in there oppose, support, or no comment. And it seems as though, again, many of the comments and the letters that we've been receiving have been very instructive toward our efforts and, kind of confirms a lot of the things you guys have already decided, which is good to see. I was very happy to see those things. So, okay, thank you, Carrie. We'll move... to item 8B on the agenda, and Gary's back up in response to the various TAC questions from our last meeting. And at the conclusion of Gary's presentation, I'm going to again ask if any members of the audience wish to comment on this. Gary?
Great, thank you, Chairman Daffer. As we do every meeting, we record questions that we felt may not have been adequately addressed at the previous meeting, and we put them in a report form. I'm just here to ask if there are any questions or if there's any refinement on the answers we may have provided. I'd like to be able to. Are there any questions?
Any questions to the information that Gary provided? Nope. Seeing none. All right. That was easy. Members of the public, any questions, comments, or concerns, issues? All right. Seeing none at this point, then we're going to call up Brady, who is going to give us an update on the website, which continues to get some pretty good traffic and in some interest. Brady? This is item 9 on our agenda.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Daffer, committee members. At the May meeting, I provided everyone with a brief update about how much traffic is flowing through the website, including the number of comments, volunteers that signed up to date, and people that have signed up for the interest list. The website has continued to steadily generate interest both in our great state, nationally, and around the world. Today, I'll be providing a similar update to last month. However, before we get started, it was brought to my attention that the Road Charge website is the first and only website designed using the latest template for the state of California. This is actually State Template version 4 and is by far the most technically advanced version of the state template ever published. The features include things like latest industry standard frameworks, responsive design capabilities, which really means fully mobile, and because of its standardized architecture, any future migrations to new templates or technologies will be greatly simplified. As technology evolves, our website will be ready, and for that, I'd like to personally thank Jigme Chimmy and Philip Hinson of our Caltrans web team. So this month, we received an additional 9 comments from the general public. We had an additional 50 volunteer sign-ups to our to participate in the program, and an additional 27 people interested in getting more information about the project. Our site visits jumped pretty dramatically, so it actually went up a little over 4,200 site visits this month. And as you can see, there still seems to be the concentration of interest from location of the visitors is still heavily centered towards Northern California. That being said, we do have a few meetings upcoming that will be in the Southern California region. Some of the new states that have shown interest in the program are Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, New Jersey, North Carolina, Utah, Virginia, and Wisconsin. That actually brings the total amount of other states that have visited our site to 26, so over half of the nation. And there's actually been a few new countries that have shown interest as well. I'm happy to say that Canada, England, and Poland are our newest countries that have visited the site, and that actually brings a total of 6 countries that have viewed the site today. Really, that's all I have today, and thank you for your time.
Any questions on the website? Eric?
Great information again. I'm just wondering, is this kind of on par with visits? Do you see an uptick in traffic to the site? I'm not a tech person. We just actually got a new website, and I don't even know how to navigate through our own website. But is this kind of on par with what historically happens with new launching of websites? Is there anything we can do within our individual organizations to pulse that information out?
Absolutely. I think with your constituencies, if you can continue to direct them to our website, it's there in the title of the slide, CaliforniaRoadChargePilot.com. Please encourage those people that are interested to visit the website, learn more about what we're doing, and if you're indeed interested, come participate, because this is something that you will be talking about the sample size of the pilot today, and we're steadily gaining interest. I think everything more than doubled since the last meeting, and so if we continue to double every meeting, I think we're going to meet our goal quite easily.
Well, it's fairly apparent to me that not everybody in this room has signed up, because otherwise that number would be much higher. So you are implored, especially members of this committee, to sign up and volunteer. I think it's very good to do it. It's, as you mentioned, Brady, it is a phenomenally well-designed website, and it's probably one of the best that I've ever seen with the state. And as you said, I guess it's the first rollout of this new template, and we were the lucky ones to have it. So to the people at Caltrans and at the state that did this, congrats, because it definitely rivals, the private sector in terms of websites. And I would really encourage everybody to not only sign up and visit the site, but get on the mailing list. Even get like a monthly thing that says, here's what's been posted. It's pretty interesting. It's very sophisticated. Professor?
I'm especially encouraged by the fact that 68 people or 68 respondents have indicated their intent to volunteer, and that leads me to suggest that perhaps there should be a follow-up with those to find out some of their characteristics. Are they truckers? Are they commercial? Are they individual citizens and so forth? And also, given that they volunteered, giving them back some contact would continue their interest as we formulate the program. They'll be on hold for months and months, but so communicating with them would help maintain their interest as well as give us some information.
That's an excellent suggestion, Professor Wax, and we fully intend on doing that.
Yeah, and again, just as mentioned by Brady, for any of you through your own constituencies, groups, city councils, supervisors, CSAC, league, what have you, suggest that people visit. Speaking of which, I know Will Kempton and I have discussed we're going to do a briefing to the CSAC board at some point soon on this effort. Next month in July, we'll be at the League of Cities meeting doing a briefing on a road charge, again, trying to disseminate this information, just letting people know this is a pilot, we're studying it, and we want input. The key thing that I tell everybody is we want your opinions. We want to know what you think. What do you like? What do you don't like? Because that's how we're going to do the best job. And this website becomes a very good tool to help facilitate that. So,
and I think I could offer up, Eric, to get sort of back to what you had mentioned earlier. If my web team could probably work with any of your constituencies or websites, and I could probably provide a link from any of your websites to our website if that would help get the word out.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah.
And look, I could do a little video of you. I can watch you.
That's because they couldn't find anything better.
But it's very cool. I just did the mobile works really nicely, and I've been able, as you've been speaking, to translate it into Finnish, into French, into Macedonian. It's really cool.
It's pretty impressive. And you know what?
I read them in those languages, but it was kind of fun.
And if you turn it horizontal, it becomes a whole different web page.
Oh, yeah,
it's what's so impressive. Very adaptive. Yeah, very responsive. So you have it horizontal, look like a regular computer. You have it up and down. It fits an Android or an iPhone. It's very well done.
Working well.
Yeah.
Feel free to sign up.
Mr. Kay.
I'm actually kind of impressed that 68 people have signed up, because it's hard to tell what you're signing up for.
Well, I'm just kidding.
It's that's not a criticism, but it's it's kind of mystifying to me that people would be signing up for something that it's not really clear. Do they get a benefit? Do they get a prize? Do they get followed by a drone? I mean, it's
or all of the above.
I don't know. I'm sort of I'm a little bit intrigued by this as well. I think I'm going to sign up and see what happens. But
better look behind you.
I'm just wondering, and maybe there's more information once you get deeper into it. But and of course, we haven't started any sort of marketing or outreach or PR or anything on that. So it's way premature. And to get large groups of people to sign up, you're going to have to tell them what's really in store, but I'm a little bit intrigued by all that.
Yeah, I think as we move forward, after we transition into an actual part of the program where people will be able to sign up based on part of what we're going to be talking about today on the Matrix, we'll probably end up with check boxes and things like that to where people can add some demographic information. So then we'll be able to use that from which we're going to pick. I mean, let's say we end up with 5,000 or 6,000. We may need 20,000 signups in order to get the 6,000. So we still, and we'll talk about that today. So yeah, clearly this definitely needs to be marketed, but it's good. I mean, you're very much at its infancy right now. Any other questions or comments to Brady? All right, thank you very much. Okay, let's move to item 10 on the agenda, and this is where we start getting into the crux of what we're going to be actually voting on today, and there's 4 key policy decisions for our meeting, and with that, we'll introduce Shannon Crum to kick us off.
Mr. Chairman, while Shannon is coming up or getting ready, I just wanted to, as you can see, we have a pretty good attendance today. We have an overflow room, which is the director's conference room, pretty much right above us. That is room 1121, and it's available for overflow if we need it. And they obviously will have to go through security to come in the building, but they can go up there, and the meeting is being webcast up there. How will they get into the director's suite?
Mara's made arrangements, so the guard will call Tina.
Okay, very good.
I don't know if they're coming because they're interested in road charge or they're just getting out of the 105-degree heat. But clearly it is nice to see this room filled. All right, with that, Shannon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. And the 105-degree heat is wonderful, I have to say, because it's a dry heat. This month we will be addressing 4 primary policy decisions, and we'll work on them throughout the course of the day. The first question for this month is, which evaluation criteria does the TAC recommend adopting for the pilot? Last month, we presented draft evaluation criteria to the TAC for your review, and we received several very thoughtful and constructive comments back. Today, Travis Dunn will present an overview of those comments that were received, as well as our responses to them, and present revised evaluation criteria for your adoption and approval. The second question, how many participants should be involved in the pilot, will be handled hand in hand with the third question, how should participants be distributed throughout the state? Both of those questions will be addressed through an interactive exercise that we will take after lunch. Just before lunch, Travis Dunn and I will walk you through the development of a matrix tool that we put together between last month's TAC meeting and today. And then when you come back, please don't eat too many carbs so you don't fall asleep. We will go through and populate the matrix and make the determination as to how many people, how they should be distributed from throughout the state, where recruitment should take place from, and what characteristics those participants should have in order to produce a meaningful pilot. And then finally, the fourth question. Last month, the TAC requested information related to non-mileage-based road charge accommodations. So the policy question for today is, which non-mileage-based road charge accommodation does the TAC recommend testing in the pilot? Jeff Doyle will be presenting information and providing context to back up staff's recommended action on this item as our last topic for the day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Travis.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For this agenda item, we wanted to provide a summary of the evaluation criteria as revised based on the very constructive and thoughtful comments that we received from many of you, as Shannon alluded earlier. So to remind everyone where we are in this process, SB 1077 empowers the TAC to create evaluation criteria and recommend evaluation criteria to be used for the pilot program. And so what we did last month was to present draft criteria for your consideration. We presented them in the briefing book that you received in mid-May. We discussed them at the meeting in Fresno, and then we asked for your written comments back, which we received by the middle of June. So between then and now, we responded to those comments, and we presented revised criteria, which came to you in Appendix 2 of the briefing book, which was an addendum released last Friday. You should have it in your packets, and the first page of that appendix is page 54 of the briefing book. So what that addendum contains is a comment response matrix summarizing the comments we received and how we responded to each one, and then following that, a summary of the new evaluation criteria as revised based on the comments that we received. To give you a flavor of the comments that we received, we received a lot of direction on the overall evaluation approach. For example, one of the comments that we received from several members was the idea of performing evaluation trade-offs across the categories that we presented. So we wanted to emphasize that that is in fact something that the independent evaluator would be directed to do. In other words, to take evaluation criteria from, for example, the cost category and relate that to evaluation criteria from other categories like compliance or enforcement and privacy, for example. So you can take two independent criteria on this list, relate them to one another, and get a sense, for example, of how well does enforcement perform, but also how does that impact privacy. We also received a number of clarifying questions on a number of the criteria, and an example of one of those that we received from everyone who commented was on the cost criteria. We had a couple of criteria related to delivering projects on time and on budget, and the question was, what does that refer to? So we clarified that to say this refers to the pilot project itself as an indicator of how well a road charge program can perform. Thirdly, we received detailed comments on specific goals and specific criteria, and that led to some revisions. One example was a clarification that we received that the equity criterion that we had on intertemporal equity was incorrectly defined, which we agreed with, so we ended up removing that criterion precisely because in the duration of a 9-month pilot, it's very difficult to get a sense of the true intertemporal equity of a road charge program. So that particular item wouldn't be something we could evaluate over the course of 9 months very easily. Some of the comments conflicted with one another. I'll get to that on the next slide. But if you want to read the full comment response matrix, it's in Appendix 2. All parties were kept anonymous to protect your privacy. So some areas we wanted to highlight. I think just about everyone who commented questioned the criterion related to behavioral changes, and we were sensitive to this, and we removed a couple of the criterion that were in this category, but I wanted to state for the members the reason we had this criterion. If the goal, in fact, is not to change behavior, we wanted to measure whether people, in fact, drive more or less as a result of the road charge so that we could see what the impact is. And there's two reasons for that. One is to inform the business case analysis down the road. If we're going to be projecting potential revenue from this system, even if the expectation is that people don't drive less as a result of a road charge, we want to be sure what we measure in the pilot that is in fact the case so that we can have a more informed business case analysis. So that was the reason for that particular criterion. It wasn't necessarily to suggest that we were encouraging behavioral changes. It was rather to measure whether in fact there were changes so that we could inform the business case. A number of criteria under the equity category received comments. And this is where one of the conflicting comments came into play. We tried to address it by finding a bit of a middle ground in the revised criteria. One comment, for example, was that all of the equity criteria should be relative to fuel taxes, and another comment was that the criteria should be not necessarily relative to fuel taxes. So what we've done is on each individual criterion, we've indicated whether it's measuring something relative to fuel taxes or not. So if it specifically says we're measuring this criterion with respect to how fuel tax performs, that is mentioned in the detailed matrix of criteria. If it's not mentioned there, then we're measuring it in general terms.
But what do you mean by general terms? What's that?
So let me give an example perhaps. On category number 4, user experience, strengthen technology, adaptability, and flexibility criteria to ensure the long-term viability of methods. So, sorry, I'm reading a comment, not a criterion. Apologies. Let's turn to page 64, which is the user experience criterion. So, just as an example, the fourth criterion and the fourth goal in this list is provide methods that are available, adaptable, reliable, and secure. And then we have criteria that relate basically to each item that's listed in that goal, and this language comes directly from Senate Bill 1077. So we're measuring these things with respect to the user perception of reliability, security, adaptability, and availability, not necessarily with respect to fuel tax, but with respect to the user perception of the reliability of the road charge itself.
But then how does equity criteria work into that?
Equity criteria are on page 67, and each one of the equity criteria is measured with respect to fuel tax.
Okay, I guess we didn't need to have this discussion then. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the last slide here is just summarizing the total criteria by category. There are a total of 50. We had 57 in the previous iteration, and based on some of the comments to simplify and combine, we ended up with slightly fewer. So we now have 50 criteria. And I wanted to turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair, to see if there are any questions or comments at this point in time. And then this afternoon, the TAC will be asked to adopt the recommendations as revised.
Okay. Any questions or comments on this? How about members of the public? Anybody want to weigh in? Lee?
I guess my only point would be that if the relative to fuel taxes is the baseline, then it seems like the best baseline on privacy is relative to fuel taxes, because fuel taxes currently have like a zero impact on privacy. Unless your credit card gets hacked.
Yeah, credit cards getting hacked at the pump. I suppose there's always something for somebody to figure out. Yeah, Supervisor?
On the non-mileage-based accommodations, when we're contemplating the miles driven on, for instance, private roads, express lanes, toll roads, et cetera, I'm wondering if we're overthinking on the credit aspect or discount aspect for those accommodations, because right now you're filling up your car at the gas station, so you're paying your state gas tax. But then, for instance, I travel on express lanes and in private developments, and I don't get a credit. Those developments are maintained privately by the developer for the residential development or agencies for express lanes, et cetera. But we don't get a credit back for those miles when we drive on private roads, for instance. So I'm wondering if we're overthinking about the credit aspect for those types of situations.
I think you raise a good point. I'll tell you, from my perspective, I look as we're moving forward with this effort. Technology is, and this is part of my talk around the state, technology will eventually make things a lot easier with privacy as a key issue. And the first thing I talk about, and I think Lee Tiem has taught me this and got him on this committee, is that I stress privacy is first and foremost the most important element. But just let me give you just a snippet of, at least where my perspective is with all of these goals and criteria. Every single one of them is important. I would put number 5 still at the top of the list personally. And then, clearly the thing that you have to look at is today when somebody buys a gallon of gas and they put in their car $5 on number 3, they don't even realize they're paying. If this is ever going to be successful long term, that's how it has to be, in my opinion. This business, and bless them, and what Oregon's doing and everybody else with paperwork and rebates and credits, it's too much. It's just not going to make sense. We've got to have a simple solution. And I know Kurt Augustine addressed us in Fresno, and I understand the reticence of the automobile manufacturers. But again, if this is consumer driven, then I think the automobile manufacturers are going to be okay. The issue becomes really, how do we make this ubiquitous? How do we make this transparent? How do we drive privacy? And how do we make it just as easy as it is today to buy a gallon of gas? And I think it's going to be transitory. It's not going to start off easy. Certainly what the legislature is talking about right now on interim funding solutions, it's probably going to have to be a 5 to 10 year deal while we perfect whatever we're going to come up with on this road charge effort. It may start off for the privacy people as something as simple as, and we're going to talk about it today, as I like to say, is buying a lotto scratch-off ticket, and you just stick something on your windshield. Much akin, I described this the other day to somebody, and they said, yeah, in New Mexico, we used to have, or Texas, vehicle inspection stickers, where you had quarterly inspections or annual inspections. It's nothing new, even in the United States. Certainly we've learned that this happens around the world. But that might be the ultimate way, from a privacy standpoint, somebody could buy their miles, especially if they're a regular driver in say, a 6,000-pound vehicle or less. But it's got to get to the point to where the technology in vehicles, as the fleet migrates and changes, ends up transmitting data that gives you a log that logs when you drive on a publicly financed road. And so when you are on a private road or a private development or a rural road or a farm road, or you drive into Mexico or what have you, the clicker isn't clicking those miles. But it has to include that privacy piece. So we'll get there, and this is part of what we're talking about, but it has to be so simple to where if it's not, it's a failure. The public's just not going to embrace it. So I think the points that you're raising are very important.
And I think to that extent, we can take advantage of the 4 million transponder users in the state of California, because they're already dealing with the privacy issues through the transponders that are in their vehicles. And it's collecting all that data, it's transmitting data, and it's billing the actual drivers who drive on those various roads. So I think they're used to that technology, and we should certainly tap into that group when we put together the pilot program.
Well, and just to address that, Supervisor, I have had somebody suggest to me, why don't you just put a transponder in every vehicle and we'll just put infrastructure along? But then I could say, well, what if you did it another way? What if all the transponders went away because we embraced technology on the vehicles, and no longer, as long as you don't mind time and place being reported, and you don't if you have a transponder, so when you do drive on that toll road or you drive on that HOV lane, at the same time you're having your mileage accounted for from a charge standpoint, you also are paying to drive on that toll bridge or that toll lane, and it all becomes behind the scenes in a very easy way to where you don't even need a transponder anymore. And that to me, I think, is where we need to go. As I look 10, 15 years out, I believe that's where we're going to end up moving. Councilmember.
And that too, to provide the flexibility of, say, just using my county as an example, Los Angeles County, if one to go into the express lanes use transponders, so maybe that might be a way in the future to have dynamic pricing on roads that are local.
Exactly.
Local to Los Angeles County, just as we have the self-help counties. And the ability to do that, technology could enable that.
The potential in this area for helping finance transportation, whether you're in an autonomous vehicle or a vehicle you're driving, is unlimited. And I think, and obviously that's the legislature's role to figure out how to do that and how to price it. But you're absolutely right. You could get into congestion-based pricing. You can get into all kinds of things once that technology is embraced. But again, I keep saying, and Lee TM taught me this, you have to also be able to have the opt-out. And I think that's part of our task here. Supervisor.
And Pam brings up a very good point about the self-help counties, because Orange County is a self-help county as well. So with Measure M2, we're going to raise about $15 billion over 30 years, and there should probably be some credit given to the residents of Orange County for that commitment.
Oh, yes.
You can add that into the equation.
There's a lot of issues there, too. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Anybody from the public in the audience? No? We'll recognize Janet Dawson, the consultant to the Assembly Transportation Committee, who's walked in. Welcome, Janet. Thanks for being here. Okay. Thank you. I think we're good. All right, let's move on to the next item on our agenda. Carrie?
That would be Travis.
Yes, okay. Thanks, Carrie. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. This portion of the meeting is the pilot participant matrix parameters discussion. And before again, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues who helped assemble this matrix, and all of the staff at CTC, Caltrans, and TAC members who helped us wrestle this challenge into something that is hopefully comprehensible and can serve as a useful tool for the discussion that you're going to have this afternoon. And just as a quick sort of procedural note, the presentation that I'm about to give is to set up the framework for making the decisions this afternoon about how many participants and how to characterize those participants as the pilot program sample. And then after lunch, hopefully during lunch you'll have time to reflect on what we present this morning. And then after lunch, Shannon will provide some more background on the demographics of California, which will further inform the choices you make this afternoon about how to populate the values in the matrix. And then we'll actually go into a dynamic activity where we put the matrix, which you'll see momentarily, up on a screen, and we'll work together to come to a solution. But before I get to the matrix, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on how we did this activity. There was some concern expressed last month in Fresno that the decisions that the TAC has been making over the last few months were beginning to become unclear in your minds as to how they all fit together and how it would be possible to construct a pilot sample that satisfied the many dimensions that were being requested to be included in the pilot. So before I get into how we built the matrix, I wanted to provide a little bit of context as to how we foresee actually recruiting the participants to be in the pilot. And what is shown on the screen here are a few examples of the methods that we foresee. First and foremost, working through you all and the work group members and your constituencies to identify volunteers to participate in the pilot. Secondly, as Brady presented this morning, using the website and social media as a tool to outreach to the general public. And then depending on how the matrix is defined today, how the communities of interest that you define, how that all plays out, doing targeted outreach to make sure that we recruit participants to meet those communities of interest that you identified today. Another item that's not on this list that I noted this morning in the public comment was working with local, county, and regional governments. I noted from the written comments from San Bernardino Associated Governments, for example, that they offered to help us recruit volunteers from their region. Very gracious offer. We'll probably take them up on it, as well as other local and regional agencies. And then lastly, up here on the list is perhaps inviting existing customers of the commercial account managers. They may have some customer roles that we can use.
Lauren?
Did you give any consideration to asking DMV to publicize it through its channels?
We hadn't gotten there yet, but certainly we'll add it as another avenue for getting out to the public. The activity of actually creating the strategy for recruitment is an activity for the next few months, and certainly that will be an item that we consider. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, I would think, I don't know if Brian Annis is here, who typically monitors these meetings for Secretary Brian Kelly, but I would imagine since he has DMV under him and a couple other departments, that's something that we should probably. Norman, do you want to comment on it?
Well, we do have DMV as part of the work group, and they've been very active with us. And we did talk at one point about maybe developing an insert that goes out with registration, the yearly registrations, and see if we could generate some discussion. And then we will have the director send out a letter to other departments, and then also Secretary Kelly. So we are working on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren, for that.
So this describes how we will recruit, but the question is, what are we recruiting to? What are our goals? How are we going to determine what the sample should be? So we have a few different methods that you might consider for sampling or putting together a sample. 38 million people in California, 28 million vehicles. We're not going to test all of them, obviously, but how do we select a representative sample that satisfies all of the interest or the groups of interest to you all? So there's a few ways you might think about doing that. One way is what we call proportional sampling, and this is where you select participants in proportion to the statewide demographics. And in order to do this, you need to select, okay, well, which demographic is it that we're trying to reflect? If it's, for example, just gender, then you'd recruit half of the participants to be women, half the participants to be men, and you wouldn't worry about any other dimensions. But likely there would be other dimensions of interest, like where in the state people live, income categories, ethnic categories, and so forth. So when you end up slicing and dicing the state down to a demographic representation by proportionality, you may end up with some outcomes that are undesirable. For example, if you had a pilot panel of 5,000, the number of rural residents would be around 300 or 350. That probably isn't enough to get meaningful feedback about how rural participants view the pilot program. So those are some of the disadvantages of doing purely proportional sampling. Another approach is random sampling, which we thought about, and we're not sure if it's even possible when we're talking about volunteers, because we'd have to go make random calls and random requests and hope that they agreed to participate. And even if they did, we're not sure that we would capture through random sampling the groups that are, again, of interest to you. So what we landed on is the notion of what we're calling judgmental sampling. This is our recommendation to you, to follow a judgmental sampling approach. And the way that we're going to approach this is to select participants in a way that guarantees meaningful representation by the subgroups that you're interested in, and we'll set targets or minimum values for each subgroup. A quick aside on qualitative versus quantitative analysis as we get into the matrix. A lot of questions as we were going through this activity about how many participants do you need in order to have statistically valid results. So I'll take a quick aside without doing a lecture on statistics to outline the idea that in order to have statistically valid results, we're getting into the notion of hypothesis testing. So the example we use here is a drug test, or rather a pharmaceutical test of whether or not a drug is effective. So in an example like that, you're testing one question. Is the drug effective? And if you have two panels, one who's taking the drug and one who's taking a placebo, and you're trying to determine whether or not the drug is in fact effective, and suppose that slightly more people in the drug sample were treated successfully than the number of people in the placebo sample, can you actually conclude that that is statistically meaningful? Well, whether or not you can depends on how large the sample size is and how big the difference is in the performance between the drug and the placebo. So in our pilot program, we're asking a lot of questions. We're not asking one binary question. For example, we might ask the participants, do you find road charging acceptable, yes or no? That could be a question that we test through statistical hypothesis testing and have a statistically valid response. But most of the questions that we're asking of our participants and of the vendors and the administrators of the pilot program are more qualitative in nature. How did it go? What did you think about it? Did the vendors comply with all of the privacy guidelines that we put in place? So those don't lend themselves necessarily to the quantitative hypothesis testing that we're talking about when we're talking about statistical validity. Some questions do, many of them don't. So that is, again, just a piece of background as we build up to the matrix. And one other piece of context is to give you some flavor for what other road charge pilots have done as far as the size of the panels that they chose. And there's much more detail in Appendix 3 of the briefing book, which was, again, an addendum that came out last Friday about each one of these 5 examples. So PSRC is Puget Sound Regional Council's traffic choices study from about 8 or 10 years ago up in the Seattle area. The first Oregon test had 260 participants. The University of Iowa did a field trial of GPS technology, specifically of GPS technology, and they did it at a number of locations around the country and had a total sample size of about 2,600 participants. Minnesota did a test with 500, and the most recent Oregon test that concluded in 2013 had a total of 88 participants. The objectives of these tests were quite distinct from what we're looking at in California, so I didn't mean to use this as a benchmark, but rather to give you a sense of what others did. So, how many participants should we recruit? That is a question for this body to decide, and we're going to ask you to use your judgment to come up with that number. It's very likely that you will come up with a number that gives us statistical validity for the overall population. In order to have statistical validity for a question, a representative of the California population, you really need about 300 to 400 or more participants. So we're pretty sure that you'll come up with a number that's larger than that. But there's a lot of qualitative considerations. We introduced in the briefing book the concept of saturation, which is a very squishy concept in qualitative research. Briefly defined, it means if we add one more participant, are they going to give us feedback that meaningfully changes what we already know? So once you reach saturation, you can say that you've gathered meaningful feedback and you've gotten the feedback that you think you need to make decisions. It's very difficult to know exactly when you've reached that point, especially if you're defining a number before you start the analysis. But keep that idea in mind as we talk through this afternoon how to set targets for each of the categories. So the approach we're going to take is bottom up. First, we're going to identify the subgroups of interest, and then we're going to leave it to you all to affirm whether or not that construct is in fact what you would like to see. And then, again, leave it to you all this afternoon to actually determine the numbers for each one of those categories. So how did we get to a manageable matrix? What do we mean by subgroup? So far, let's look at the left-hand side of the table up here, which is shaded in blue.
I just love how you're consolidating 13,824 subgroups into, what, 4 or something?
32. Starting with 13,824, we're going to try and get it down to a manageable number. So we read down the columns on the left-hand side. These are decisions that this body has already made. We've already made decisions about vehicle weight classes to consider, vehicle status, i.e. private versus commercial, participant status, whether it's an individual or a complete household, a business, or a public agency. And then we have a host of operational concepts to consider. Today, in the afternoon, we'll be addressing how to define other dimensions, such as whether or not participants are from urban, suburban areas versus rural or agricultural areas, the income level, and then the geographic region of the state, northern, central, or southern. So if you take each one of the categories across each of these 7 dimensions and multiply them together, you get 13,824 subgroups. For example, if we just take the first bullet in each column, and we'll define a subgroup by reading across the first bullet in each column. Passenger cars that are privately registered, that belong to an individual who chooses a time permit method, lives in an urban or suburban area, in a low-income household in Northern California. That's one subgroup. There are people that represent that subgroup. If we continue this activity for all the permutations in this table, we could theoretically define 13,824 subgroups. That's a lot. But fortunately, many of these don't actually exist. And furthermore, we would like to make a few recommendations for you all to consider about simplifying the vehicle weight category from 8 down to 3, which makes the math even easier. So instead of having 8 weight classifications, we'll have passenger cars and light-duty pickups as one category, medium trucks as a second category, which encompasses class 3 through 6, and then heavy trucks as a third category, which is class 7 and 8 trucks. Question?
So essentially, we would just cobble together different types of large trucks into that last category.
Correct.
So it wouldn't, okay.
Rather than being specific about we need a certain number of class 5 versus 6, right, it's not that meaningful of a distinction. So here are our basic approach for help that we're recommending to you all for your consideration to make this a bit more manageable. And again, the first one is to simplify the weight classes from 8 down to 3. Secondly, the real brunt of this exercise was in wrestling with the matrix to down select by eliminating subgroups that either didn't exist, were very uncommon, or weren't really meaningful. So I'm going to give you an example of each one of those. There's no such thing as a commercial agency vehicle. Agency vehicles are by definition exempt. So that category does not exist, so we can eliminate it from the list of 13,000.
So now we're down to 13,863.
Exactly.
All right. So, okay.
One by
How much
one.
time do you all have here? We're going to be here a while.
We have till lunch. Well, I have to say, Shannon and I owe a debt of gratitude because we wrestled with this from the very beginning, and we have to thank the Foxhole Tavern in Austin for providing us the venue and the space and the elements for...
I would imagine it would take a tavern to go through 13.
Secondly, there are a number of categories, or one in particular that we thought was pretty rare. And this one is a heavy truck that is by definition commercial that belongs to an individual. So let's be very clear about what we're saying here. There are a lot of owner-operators, which is basically one driver, one truck. He owns the truck, he drives it, he or she drives it. That is a commercial vehicle by definition, and most often it's being used for business purposes. What we mean by this category is that very rare individual who owns a truck and uses it for their personal transportation exclusively, to go to the grocery store, to go to the doctor. We thought that was a fairly unusual circumstance, and we didn't really think that you needed to have that group as part of the panel to be selected for the pilot. So we wanted to focus on trucks that are used commercially rather than someone who's driving a tractor trailer around to the dentist. The third category that we decided to sort of simplify is those that we didn't think provided as meaningful distinctions for comparing outcomes. So, for example, when we get to the heavy truck component, that third category of vehicles by weight, what's more important, that we select trucks that are in northern versus central or southern California, or small fleet, medium-sized fleet, large fleet? We felt that the latter was more instructive, because most of these vehicles, the heavy trucks, are doing longer distance operations, so where they're domiciled isn't as important as what size fleet they are, for example, as a characteristic. There may be other characteristics that matter as well, and when we get to the discussion of filling out the matrix, we can sort of put asterisks on that bucket and say we want to make sure we capture these other characteristics as well. Lastly, and this is a very important recommendation, we wanted to suggest that we allow participants to select the operational concepts rather than being constrained into an operational concept. In other words, when they sign up, we give them a choice, and they make the choice. There's a lot of valuable information in letting them choose. Just in the mere fact of letting them choose, we can understand what people prefer based on what they read about the concept and what choices they make, and that informs the business case. It informs the policy choices about how to frame the various operational concepts. So, for example, rather than having the Technical Advisory Committee specify, we want to have, out of the private vehicles in Southern California that belong to low-income households in an urban area, we want to make sure that 100 of those choose a time permit, 100 choose a mileage permit, 100 choose an odometer-based charge. What we'd rather suggest is that we leave it open for the individuals in that category to choose. We can specify minimum values for each concept to make sure that we get feedback on each one, but we don't want to constrain it, because that then it kind of explodes the number of participants that we need in order to meet those targets.
Are we going to allow volunteers to change their mode of operation during the test, because they're not going to know that much about it when they make a selection to begin with, and they might decide that they want to change their approach. Is that something that we can accommodate?
I'm going to write it down as a question.
I think that's
You don't need to answer it right now.
That's an excellent
I'm glad you raised
parking lot issue to come back and analyze. Absolutely. Thank you, Laurie.
Yes.
I'd say about that is, well, two things. One is, I think it's valuable if we can give people concisely and clearly, this is a lot of information to digest. So what that looks like, I'd love if we could have a chance to see how you develop that. I think that based on that, having the opportunity to see from a larger universe of potential participants how they choose, that'll be valuable information. I'd also like us to then, I think this is implicit in what you're saying, but just to confirm it, that if we have 10,000 people signing up and 5,000 of them want to use whatever operational concept, we're going to not take as many from that group, right, to balance it out.
Exactly, and what we'll do this afternoon is give you the opportunity to specify exactly what minimum number you think is appropriate for each one of those concepts, so that we don't end up in a situation where everyone in the test chose one and we didn't get feedback on the others. Yes, question?
Are some of these permits going to be vehicle specific? Because right now, if you have a transponder, you can take it between different vehicles in a household. But for instance, your time permit, your odometer permit, and your mileage permit, if a family of 4 has 3 different vehicles, are you going to let them switch off between the vehicles, or is it going to be vehicle specific in the program?
I think Matthew can answer that next month for sure. I think I can take a crack at some of the concepts. The odometer concept for sure is specific to the vehicle, because the measuring device is part of the vehicle.
Right, exactly.
I believe the mileage permit probably would be the same way, because it's tied to the vehicle license plate. We can take that back and address it later as well. Okay. Without further ado, the next slide is the matrix.
Drum roll, please.
So we ended up with 32 subgroups, and here they are. I'll try to walk through it. By the way, before I walk through it, there are red numbers here. Those are placeholders. They are not recommendations. They are not suggestions. It's just to give you a sense of where the numbers will go when we type in the numbers this afternoon that you all suggest. But it's just there as a reference point, not as a recommendation.
That's going to be part of our interactive exercise this afternoon.
So across the top, it's green shaded, or for those who don't see color too well, it's the top row, if you will, of this diagram. Those are commercial vehicles. So we've divided commercial vehicles based on their size. So you can see the little icons that we have a passenger car, and then in the middle there, three medium trucks, and then on the right-hand side, 3 large trucks. The passenger cars are further broken down by whether they're in northern, central, or southern California. Medium-sized trucks are also broken down by whether they're in northern, central, or southern California. And then the heavy vehicles on the right-hand side are broken down into buckets based on whether it's a small fleet, a medium fleet, or a large fleet. And you'll have an opportunity this afternoon to define what we mean by small, medium, and large. Next, the lower left quadrant, which is orangish shaded, that is private vehicles, which corresponds with individuals and households. So we have 18 subgroups here, and they're defined by whether they're urban and suburban versus rural or agricultural, whether they're low, middle, or high income, again, a parameter which you'll have an opportunity to define this afternoon, and whether they're in northern, central, or southern California. So, for example, I wonder if I could, does the pointer show up? Let's take this box right here where the pointer is. So that box is private vehicles, individuals, low income, urban or suburban, and central California. That's how that category is defined. So there's 18 boxes just like that, subgroups. Next to the right of that in blue, it's outsized. This is not to scale, obviously. We're talking about the out-of-state vehicles that this committee earlier recommended you'd like to see included in the pilot. So you have an opportunity to specify how many out-of-state vehicles should be included, whether they're passenger cars, medium trucks, or heavy trucks. And next to that, the number of agency vehicles, which is in the sort of off-white or beige-colored cell. And then lastly, on the lower right quadrant is a special category for Native Americans living on tribal lands specifically. That was a special category we wanted to call out for your consideration. If you'd like to include that subgroup, there's an opportunity to specify the number of participants you'd like from that group as well. So this afternoon, we'll go through and populate each one of the cells in this matrix and calculate a total number based on your specifications of the number of participants you'd like to see in each subgroup. A few other considerations that are sort of cutting across this entire matrix. And these are questions for you to consider as you do this. We talked about a couple of these. For each subgroup, do you want to specify a minimum number of operational concepts that you'd like to see tested? Along the same lines, would you like to specify a minimum number of complete households out of those private cars versus individuals? So those are 2 opportunities you'll have to basically give us a target or a minimum that you want to make sure are included for those 2 items. And then the second grouping here on the bottom half of the slide is across the entire group of passenger cars, again, that orange shaded lower left quadrant, are there targets or minimum values that you would like to ensure that we reach for age groups, ethnic representation, gender balance, or special classes of vehicles? We didn't want to specify these dimensions within each one of those 18 boxes, but across the entire population of those 18 boxes, we want to make sure that we're capturing a reflective panel along these dimensions as well. So you'll have an opportunity to give us some direction on how to address these with either targets or minimum values for each group. Lastly, is there anything we missed? So sort of as a catch-all, as you affirm the framework that we've presented, are there other groups that sort of stand out that we've missed that we can layer in here? Question?
On the vehicles, just have a mix in the classifications that also include not just gas vehicles, but also the hybrids, electric, and compressed natural gas as well. So we get a mixture of types of vehicles with fuel differences.
Great, thank you. That's exactly the type of input we'd like to have on the total panel, making sure we have minimum on those types. Thank you. Okay, that's it for my presentation. I'll take questions.
I participated in the telephone conversation, and something occurred to me afterward, which I should have raised. That always happens, of course. Every slide that you just showed that had that described the groups, the subgroups, used the word minimum. Yet the table has a range of a minimum and a maximum. And I can't think of any reason to set a maximum at this point in any of the categories. For statistical purposes, there would be no negative to having, 105 instead of 100, where you say 50 to 100. And it would simplify the presentation going to the public or presenting it to legislators to say, we want at least this number in this category. And later, if we have a surfeit of people in one category, we can cut it back. But there's no need to specify a maximum.
I actually think that's a really interesting suggestion, and in the conversation this afternoon, it might make it flow easier if we take that approach of focusing on the minimum number in setting these values. So I appreciate the comment.
Any other questions, comments? Any members of the public wish to weigh in on this notion before we get into the exercise this afternoon? Nope. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to catch up on my agenda here. So we'll be on item 13 now, which are the pilot program design considerations, location, distribution, and the matrix. We'll do a reprise on the matrix. Is that going to be Shannon or Carrie?
Thank you.
So this is item 13 on the agenda for those following along, pilot program design considerations.
This is item 13, and just now Travis introduced a number of terms that everybody knows what they mean, but nobody agrees. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes running through some definitions that apply to the matrix so that this afternoon when we come back and begin to populate, we're all working from a common
Keep saying this afternoon at the rate we're going, it might be before
we may
lunch.
get through it before then. We may yet meet your goal of leaving early.
This task force has gotten so good. Thank you.
So the primary goal at this point is to address the two policy questions that have to do with how many participants should be involved in the pilot and how they should be distributed throughout the state. And what you have on the slide before you is a slightly modified version of the matrix that Travis was showing you. I find that the older I get, the larger I need my fonts and figures to be able to see them. So I blew up some of the icons and the text and simplified the graphic just a little bit. As we move through, we need to spend a little bit of time before we move into assigning numbers into really addressing what we mean by North, Central, and Southern California, or is that even the appropriate breakdown geographically in terms of deciding how participants should be distributed throughout the state. What we really mean by urban and suburban and rural and agricultural, and so that everyone agrees on those definitions, and what we mean by low income, medium income, and high income, because it not only does it vary as you move throughout the state, but there are many different definitions that different agencies and researchers use. And then also to solicit a lot of feedback about how to define small fleet, medium fleet, and large fleet. I think our primary consideration is really to be able to gather good feedback from both owner-operators and also very large companies that run large fleets. But I am by no means a trucking industry expert, so we'll be soliciting feedback on how to properly define those categories. And so once we've done that, we'll be able to go back to the pilot. And again, I don't know that the answer or the purpose here is to come up with the right answer in terms of what a definition of urban is or the definition of rural. I can show you 5 different federal agencies that will use 5 different definitions for the purposes of their work. The purpose here is to define things so that we, again, have the common framework, everyone knows what everyone is talking about, and we maintain flexibility to be able to meet the goals of the TAC in terms of recruiting and garnering good data for future policy decisions. Okay, so the first steps, just which vehicles are included. This just reiterates that what we have done is to propose eliminating some categories that we think either don't exist or are not likely to provide useful feedback for the group. And so as we move into our analysis, and the first thing we'll seek to define is what is rural and agricultural versus urban and suburban. We no longer have kind of 6 or 7 different categories of vehicles to consider. It really is just passenger vehicles, medium-duty trucks, and heavy trucks. The passenger vehicles would include light trucks like pickups. But then when we start to talk about individuals and households, breaking that down into urban, suburban, and rural agricultural subgroups. And in the briefing book, I made the comment that everybody knows what rural looks like. They know it when they see it, but when you ask them to define it, they always revert back to, well, it's not a city, or it's not an urban area. And so we want to spend some time talking about that. Different organizations, pardon me, approach this differently. And what I have here is just a very simple diagram. On the far left-hand side, I don't think that anyone would argue that that is a scene that represents an agricultural environment or a rural environment, which incidentally, they're not necessarily synonymous. They frequently are. And on the far right-hand side, we've got Los Angeles, with a population density throughout the metro area of about 8,200 people per square mile. Just for context, that's Calcutta. Sorry, I lied. That's Shanghai, at about 156,000 people per square mile. So, urban areas can become quite dense. The question is, I guess, where along that line do we draw the dividing line, right? Is it 1,000 people per square mile, 2,000 people per square mile, 2,500 people per square mile? Is it within commuting distance of a major urban area, even if it's sparsely populated? So, without going into too much detail, this map kind of illustrates the population density of California. And one of the federal definitions, and it's one of the ones that the U.S. Department of Agriculture uses, talks about rural in terms of census tracts that have a population density of less than 1,000 people per square mile. And that's the very, very, very faint yellow. You can see that there's a lot of it, and it's distributed fairly well throughout the state. However, while there is a lot of it, it accounts for only about 35,000 people in the state. And so by using that definition of rural, of areas with less than 1,000 people per square mile, you're limiting your pool of available participants to recruit from. And if you can't find the number that you want from within that 35,000, you either have to retroactively change your definition or just say we're out of luck. The Census Bureau uses a slightly different definition, and it's based on an OMB, an Office of Management and Budget definition of urban areas or urban clusters of less than 2,500 people per square mile. And if going with that definition, it actually raises the pool of people available to recruit from for your rural and agricultural communities to about 1.4 million, which is a significantly better pool to be recruiting from. I know that this looks like I just sort of threw oatmeal this morning or something at the map of California. What all those little blobs are the census-defined urban areas and urban clusters. So those are the boundaries of areas that have census tracts of a population density greater than 2,500 people per square mile. And again, using this definition, and this is based on the 2010 census, there are some more recent estimates, the numbers vary just a little bit, not tremendously. Using this definition, you'll have a pool of less than 33 million available to be considered urban because, let's face it, some of them are under the age of 16 and do not drive, but approximately 1.9 million available rural pool to pull from. Another definition that's widely used, and this is a little bit tricky, is that of metropolitan statistical areas. This is a definition that the Office of Management and Budget uses to define, and it's the standard for all federal agencies have to use for reporting on metro data. This does not actually define urban and rural, it defines metro and non-metro. And a lot of you, especially those who work with MPOs, are probably very familiar with these boundaries that are up in front of you. It typically is one or more dense urban centers, and then it comprises entire counties and adjacent counties that have a good deal of economic interaction with the urban center. Using this definition or breakdown to kind of describe urban and suburban and then rural and agricultural drives your metro population up to close to 37 million and leaves really only about 260,000 people available to select or to recruit your rural population from. We're recommending against this option, but it is an option. And one of the benefits that it does have is that these boundaries will align with MPO boundaries and also with transportation plans that various organizations have published. And so for comparison purposes, it is an option. A third option that's available for kind of defining what is urban or suburban. Oh, and I should actually go back and mention, this does actually quite nicely capture suburban developments because it includes entire counties around the densely populated urban areas. A third option that's available to you is to use what the United States Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service uses to define rural and primarily agricultural counties versus urban areas. The challenge in California is that only 4 counties are categorized by this organization as being completely non-metro and rural, which gives you a population that is quite small to recruit from, and it's the dark green ones on the map. It's Alpine, Mariposa, Sierra, and Trinity counties. And it's about 36,000 people. Yeah.
What you could do is contact CSAC, and they've broken the 58 counties into rural, urban, and suburban, and just get their definitions and how they've laid out the state of California. That might be helpful.
I think Lauren wants to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I just want to, I don't mean this by way of interrupting or diverting your presentation, because I understand you're really trying to make sure there's a good fit between the information that's out there and the goals of the committee. But I suppose my admonition is that we've been asked to design a pilot project that can get the support of the administration and the legislature first and foremost, and a hallmark of that's going to have to be simplicity and the ability of these elected officials and appointed officials to understand what it is we're talking about. And in California, I think that I agree. We know it when we see it, but we tend to think in terms of counties and regions, and that's our frame of reference. And we pretty much know in California that urban is a couple of big blobs along the coast, and maybe a couple of small blobs like where we're sitting inland, and everything else is rural, and that's pretty much it. And you know, I do appreciate that you know we're trying to get something that we're not going to get criticized for, but you know what, we're going to get criticized for a lot of these decisions, and it's just not. We're just going to have to deal with that. But I'm hoping that when all is said and done, that we err on the side of being simple, because because our audience here, they're not going to want stuff that's really not simple. So my recommendation to you, or I guess maybe it's to the committee, is to think in terms of the counties and think in terms of what makes sense to us, because that's what's going to resonate with the people that are going to be reading this and acting on it.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with Lauren. If you look at this map, and if you didn't know California, you would think that, from Imperial County all the way up through some of the northern counties, there's tons of people, whereas we know that, there's more concentrations in the Bay Area and Southern California. And I know in the Central Valley, from Kern County up through San Joaquin County, it's roughly 4 million people. That's about 12% of the population. So it's that, and I would consider that to be rural. So the fact that, looking at this map, it's just like looking at it like it's not rural. I think it's really a misrepresentation. So anyway, I'd just like to support those comments.
Any other comments at this point? Supervisor?
Yeah, I know there was a reference made to CSAC, and also there's RCRCs where they break it out by population and to define whether it's rural or whatnot. And I'm not advocating for anything, but there are a couple of things that we really do need to consider. One is poverty levels that is already accounted for. But miles traveled, we're talking about a transportation pilot thing. So the main consideration should be, in certain areas, how far do people have to travel to get basic necessities or basic infrastructure, whether it's hospital or whether it's the planning permit place. And that, if we can, that abstract concept probably would help you to define rural better than just looking at it and being able to identify it. So don't just go on population.
Mr. Chair, if I could build on that.
Yes.
I guess, or maybe I'll ask the question, Shannon, I think this is the question, is for the purposes of what we're trying to pilot, what are the relevant characteristics? And I think that Supervisor Finnegan has said what I was thinking, is that you may live in the city of Fresno, but maybe your driving patterns and behaviors and maybe those are relevantly different than if you lived in the city of Oakland. So do you have any thoughts about how the answer to that question would help us decide this question?
I think our recommendation that addresses partly that and also some of Supervisor Finnegan's comments would be to use the first of the options that I've presented, where we're defining urban and suburban as really those urban clusters and urbanized areas that are really recognized as being densely populated.
Would you show that on the screen, please?
Sure. It's the one that looks like I threw oatmeal at the wall. This one. And so you can see, if you can see where the oatmeal is on top of the darker shaded census tracts. It's LA, San Diego, Bay Area, so San Francisco, San Jose, and then a good part of the Central Valley, including Sacramento. What that does, it doesn't encompass entire counties, and so that leaves you the flexibility to work with county government and to work with local planning organizations to be able to more precisely target areas of those counties or areas of those regions that they consider to be truly rural or truly agricultural versus just outside an urban boundary.
Okay, what I'd really like to do with this, because there's other people out there that have done a great job defining what they consider rural and urban, whether it's CSAC, the League. Here's a website. This is the, what do they call themselves? It's the Rural Counties, founded more than 40 years ago to represent small rural counties. 2.7 million residents comprising 50% of the state's landmass, more than 70% of it in the U.S. Forest Service. Here's their map, and you can see that's what they consider rural. Let's not get too far into the weeds on this. I'm going to ask that staff from CTC work with the consultants to provide them with state of California recognized entities, whether it's HCD, whether it's CSAC, whether it's the League, so we don't have to try to reinvent the wheel here. It's already been done. The state recognizes it. The legislature recognizes it. That's the area we want to go. And I'd like to do that just in the interest of keeping us moving forward so we can continue on. So let's just assume, for discussion's sake, we've got that part figured out.
Okay.
Can I ask one question? Was anything in this matrix developed with, is there mass transit available?
No, that is not part of the matrix.
I mean, does a person have an option to drive?
That seems very...
That's something that we ought to look at, too.
And I would suggest that your last map probably identifies that. I could catch a bus or a dial-a ride in Crescent City, but I couldn't in Smith River, Klamath, or Gasky.
So then the second topic for today has to do with defining low income, medium income, and high income. And again, every agency does it a little bit differently. The three different kind of options that we'll present today and then make a recommendation on for adoption for use in the matrix have to do with how the Census Bureau defines the federal poverty level, how the California Department of Housing and Community Development defines various income ranges for use in their programs, and then also the concept of living wage. I will note that these are not static numbers. That's not a one number applies statewide. They all have an element of the size and composition of households, and so there are several different numbers for each of these. The first of these has to do with the United States Census Bureau and its poverty thresholds. The limitation of this is that it's not adjusted geographically. So there is a one-size-fits-all answer regardless of whether you're living in a high-cost area or a low-cost area. The obvious benefit to that is that it's much simpler to apply, but it may not be truly reflective of the particular environment. And as you can see, it ranges from a low of about $11,000 income per year for a household with no children, up to, and I cut it off at 4 related children under 18. It actually carries out through 9 related children under 18, of about $27,800 for a family with 5 people and 4 related children. A second option for the purposes of defining the income ranges that we'll use in the matrix it comes from California Department of Housing and Community Development, and it initially bases income limits on those federal poverty levels. However, it goes through a process of indexing them to local economic conditions, primarily having to do with the cost of housing, although that's not the only input. And it breaks it into 5 different categories. So it talks about extremely low income, very low income, very low income, median income, and moderate income. And there is a separate set of categories for each county in the state and also for metro areas within counties. So I have one example, not the entire state. And again, it's based on composition of the household, the number of people in the household, and this is just the example from Calaveras County. The 4-person median income in that county is $70,200 a year. So these ranges are based on that median, and it ranges again from a low of about $14,700 for a 1-person household, being considered extremely low, up to $111,200 for a moderate income household with 8 members. So this is another option. Again, there are 58 of these tables, 1 for each county, and then another dozen or so for the various metropolitan statistical areas around the state.
So have we thought about how we're going to be, when we're recruiting people, we're going to be asking them their income? Is that how it works? We're going to say, just so we can put you in a bucket? Are we going to say, you can't participate if you don't give us your income? Are we going to say that?
Can I just answer that? Or, I mean, again, that's the decision of this task force, and if the task force wants that to be part of the criteria, we can, and if not, we don't.
Well, so we're going to schedule a discussion about that.
We should, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's kind of, okay.
Again, this is a task force-driven effort, not a consultant-driven effort.
No, I agree. And I was probably shouldn't have been looking directly at Shannon when I said that, but
she's the one speaking.
I'm facing this direction. So.
All of these decisions are your decisions.
Yes.
If the analysis that you want to come back has a component that has to do with how this particular program impacts different income groups, then income will be a question.
I should be looking at Richard when I say this.
That we have to ask.
Yeah.
Richard should be speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to end up with something at the end of the day that's going to be buckets, right? It's not going to be, do you make $25.72 an hour? It's going to be, do you make between 0 and 50 or whatever based on household size? So I think the question is, do we also want to ask people, optionally to say exactly, more exactly what their income is, and maybe we should. But I think probably a pretty non-intrusive question would get...
And that's... That's something that people would be okay with.
Well, I've talked to all those people, and they've... No, I mean, this is the question. Yeah, this is one of the questions. Will people see this whole thing as such a morass that they'll turn away, or will it be simple enough that they'll want to participate?
Got to keep it simple.
And in your response to, do we turn them away? Again, that's your call. I can say that they could still participate. We just would not be able to use their data to answer the income-specific questions. Right? They could certainly contribute to other analysis, but not those related to income. Okay. All right. So the third option that we're presenting and for kind of establishing low, medium, and high income has to do with the concept of a living wage. This is last year's figures, and it's specific to Los Angeles County, but again, it's sort of broken down by household composition. And this chart compares what is recommended as a living wage versus the federal poverty levels, what it would break down as an hourly rate versus the minimum wage at the time. So that is a third option. And again, there's a separate chart for every county in the state. And the 2015 figures are being updated sort of as we speak. Now we're going to ask you to come to a decision. I believe our recommendation is going to be to adopt the second option, but to do some simplification. And rather than maintaining the 5 categories of extremely low, very low, low, median, moderate, to compress the extremely low, very low, and low income groups to be our low income group, the median and moderate to be our medium income group, and then anyone making above the moderate income for the household would be in the high income group.
I think there was consensus in Richard's comment recently. That's pretty much the idea, to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, I would just, I think, so I agree with this, except that the second category should be moderate income. Median is on that chart because all of the other categories are percentages of median, but median itself is not a category.
Okay.
Yeah, so I agree with this, and I'll also just say on the prior issue of rural, suburban, urban, HCD also has, for purposes of the housing element law, has default densities that may be a useful way to track that question as well.
Yeah, we didn't present those. I was trying to keep it simple, so we didn't present those. But yes, we have those.
Okay. All right, even though it's an information item, I see consensus that we're going to go with option 2, hearing no other resistance from anybody. All right, continue on.
The third set of definitions to consider is how to talk about splitting up the state geographically, north, central, and south or southern California, for the purposes of commercial passenger vehicles, commercial medium-duty trucks, and then all of the private vehicles that are used by individuals and in households. The goal here really is to ensure that we achieve parity in geographic distribution, that we don't end up with 5,000 or 7,000 or 12,000 volunteers from the LA metro area, because that would not be representative of the entire state. And so the discussion here is really how do we ensure that we achieve a good distribution from around the state. Here is one proposed division, dividing the state into 3 general areas, north, central, and south. We did also look at a coastal inland distribution. What ends up happening there is that coastal is urban and inland is rural predominantly. So once we come to an agreement on the urban-rural definition, we really kind of do have a coastal inland breakdown already. And so this adds a further dimension by doing northern, central, and southern. But we're certainly open to feedback and comment.
Can I just comment on that, Shannon? I think that we want to pay some attention to that, because we could end up with a statistically significant rural sample from the north and not from the Central Valley. And I think that would be a problem.
Well, keeping in mind, we will still have the urban-rural and north-central-south. So you will still be able to say rural north and rural central as 2 separate subgroups of interest.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think where it would be duplicative is if we had the coastal inland and you said coastal rural, which is not a very large amount of people to draw from, and inland urban, which again is not a very large number of people, could be boxing ourselves into a corner in terms of recruitment. And so this allows some more flexibility. You end up with a 6-dimension matrix just with urban, rural, northern, central, and southern. Was that clear as mud? Okay. Again, just the census defined urban areas and urbanized clusters. On top of that, you can see what this provides is a mix of urbanized areas and rural areas in each of those 3 zones. And so I guess the answer we need from you at this point is there consensus that these boundaries are appropriate, or would you like to suggest a different way of dividing the state geographically?
I'll just comment for the committee, and if anybody else wants to weigh in. Again, I think that it looks good on the map. I would also still want to just defer, as Richard pointed out, and as I did probably a week or so ago when we discussed this, that HCD and other state agencies have probably also identified these boundaries, and I'd want to make sure that anything that we adopt is consistent with what the state is already recognizing as standard.
Do you have a preference, a priority in terms of which agency to conform to? Because
I'll defer to Will and the staff to get back with you on that.
Okay, all right.
Ann?
I understand the box that we could get put into in trying to have north, central, south, rural, urban. If we tried to break it down into coastal and inland, it would create a challenge. But almost as important as the data we'll receive from the pilot is the perception of the participants in the pilot and the perception of those people who are going to be looking at the pilot to see what it means. One of the biggest concerns that I hear, and Riverside County, depending on the definition, is rural, but there's a very large population there in the suburban area. Biggest thing I hear is they're only talking to people who live in the big cities, and what we say doesn't matter. I think the pilot's going to have to demonstrate that there was diversity from a coastal and inland perspective, or you won't have buy-in. So maybe it's not that you focus on the subgroups, but that there are ways of getting optional questions in there to help further drill down into the details. Because I think if there's a perception that only those on the coast or only those in rural areas are being surveyed, you've got millions of people who are living in a suburban area that won't feel like they've been counted.
I think that's a good point. I mean, and again, that's the issue that I don't want us to be blazing new territory on geographical definitions or socioeconomic definitions. That's not our role. I think what we need to do is to figure out what it is that the State Transportation Agency is most comfortable with, that we use. Ultimately, this is something we should probably also consult with our legislative consultants on both the Assembly and the Senate, just to have some consensus to make sure that we're following along a process that the legislature is comfortable with as well, because again, ultimately, our report is going to go back to the legislature, and I want to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Thank you. Richard?
I agree with you, Jim. I think, though, the struggle that we're going to have the challenge we're going to have to overcome is, I think, are people in Riverside County all going to be treated as rural, in which case the sample may all be from the city of Riverside or some of the bigger cities and suburbs, or are we going to finesse it more so that we do have that oatmeal thing and we can say, actually, this is rural densities and this is not.
So you make total sense. There has to be a common sense approach to this. There's obviously a blend. You have urban areas and you have rural areas. And I think we may be overcomplicating it. Maybe it's just me. It doesn't seem like it's that complicated. But names, definitions, et cetera, I just want to be consistent with the rest of the state. Okay, continue.
Okay. So moving on to truck fleets. For the purposes of heavy trucks, which again are the Class 7 and Class 8 tractor-trailer types of vehicles, rather than focus on their geographic distribution for where they're domiciled, we are proposing that we divide those into various fleet sizes. The idea being that we're very cognizant of the fact that small owner-operators function differently than very, very large fleet managers do. And it's important to solicit feedback from all of them, a wide range of different business types. And so I have some background information about just sort of the distribution of various truck fleet sizes. It turns out that registered in California are about 500,000 trucks, medium-duty and heavy-duty combined, that are part of a fleet that's between 1 and 9 vehicles. And then the remaining groupings are significantly smaller. So, 60,000 or so in a fleet of 10 to 19. And then by the time you get up to fleets of 5,000 or greater, it's about 55 or 60,000 vehicles in the state in those fleet sizes. Another consideration here also has to do with how the trucks are used and which industries are using them. And so this simply shows the number of those medium and heavy-duty trucks by industrial sector. You can see that agriculture is about 75,000. Construction, wholesale and retail trade, and utilities and services are by far the largest number of registered trucks on the roads. Just kind of grouping together primary sector activities, construction and manufacturing, and then tertiary, moving finished goods, doing various utilities and services, and then for hire types of activities. Somebody asked that we have them ranked in order from highest to lowest, so that's what it looks like, ranked in order from highest to lowest. So in terms of defining small, medium, and large fleets, the proposal that we're putting forward is that we'll consider any fleet with fewer than 50 trucks as a small fleet, being sure probably to have maybe disproportionately that 1 to 9 range to make sure we are in fact capturing the owner-operators. From 50 to 1,000 trucks as medium and more than 1,000 as large. But as I said, I am not a trucking industry expert, so this is very much open to your input and discussion.
Mr. Sauer.
I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but been around the block a few times with the industry. I think the range looks okay, but for the purposes of the pilot, for the large, those are pretty much out-of-state domiciled fleets. The days of the large California-based fleets are pretty much a thing of the past. If that's something that maybe we can work together on defining kind of the classifications, because if you're going with a large fleet, you're going to be going after the out-of-state folks to be part of the pilot, which is something that we will definitely take head on. But I just want to make sure that I'm myself and some other so-called experts from the industry are working hand in hand and closely with the consultants from here on out, because this is completely, it's a lot different than just dealing with the average motoring general public. And so the Oregon pilot didn't have trucks, Washington didn't even sniff the trucks, so this is kind of a new frontier, and the magnitude of folks that are going to be participating is pretty tremendous. So I just want to make sure that we're not rushing, especially for the trucking portion of it, that we're not rushing on piecing something together. And I would, ask, and this is something that I was going to ask this committee later on, is it imperative that we make these decisions relative, and I'm sorry to be selfish, for the trucks today? I would really like to drill in with the consultants and some of my folks to really hone in on this, to make sure that we have a good sample, B, that I have something that's tangible and easy to more or less sell to get people into the pilot. Just more or less just doing our due diligence on this. And in volunteering my time, my staff's time on this, we will put stuff on the back burner just because we want to make sure that this is, if it works at the end of the day, everybody, is sitting around the campfire holding hands and it's high-fiving all over the place. That's what we're looking for. If it's not, I want to make sure that we're ironing out those issues. That was my kind of 5-minute ramble. Sorry.
That wasn't even 5 minutes. Any other comments or questions on the trucking? I think that's very instructive, and I would advise the consultants to work with Eric and his association to get this mix down as we get to kind of coming through on this matrix today. We'll start talking numbers too, and we've bantered about some numbers. We don't know what it'll ultimately be, but clearly 10 is better than 1, and probably 25 is better than 10. So
there's so many different nuances of the trucking industry, the logistic world. It's very complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's so many different segments. I mean, you're talking geographic regions, ag heavy. Those guys are going to the field, to the first point of processing, and that's it. And it's seasonal. So you have seasonal, you have the long haul, you have a heavy haul guy that comes in and moves like a space shuttle, or windmill towers. There's just so many different moving parts, and I want to make sure that we're not forgetting anything, and we're piloting as many folks and many different operations as possible.
thank you. Okay, Shannon, keep on going.
Okay. The next question is, where should the pilot be conducted? And we've provided a number of options in the briefing book and described the benefits and constraints offered by each. And there are several different ways that you could approach this. One would be to target a small number of those metropolitan statistical areas. They would include both urban and rural environments, just 2 or 3 of those throughout the state, and conduct the pilot from those 2 to 3 locations. Another option would be to have a slightly larger number of pilot locations, 6 or 8 counties distributed throughout the state. The benefit of those, and the third option as well, would be to select a small number of large cities to act as hubs and then recruit rural participants from nearby those hubs. The obvious benefit to those 3 options is that they have the potential to make the management of the pilot simpler, because you have a smaller geographic area to manage. The obvious downside is that it has the potential to marginalize some communities or to miss important communities because they're not within the geographic boundaries that have been selected. So the fourth option is just open it up statewide, and that is in fact our recommendation, is to conduct the pilot as a statewide pilot. The fifth option would be some combination of the above. So for instance, you could say, we're going to start with 6 to 8 counties scattered throughout the state, and if we're unable to recruit the targets that we've set up for various subgroups of interest, then we would open it up statewide in order to make sure we hit those targets. And so again, just based on kind of the geographic diversity, the fact that population is concentrated along the coast and in just a couple of communities in the Central Valley, that income is not evenly distributed throughout the state, and then in fact the number of businesses are not evenly distributed throughout the state, we're recommending probably statewide. However, this is what the other options might look like. So for instance, you could say we're just going to do 2 to 3 metropolitan statistical areas, and again, those would include both very urban and potentially rural environments, and do one in the north, one somewhere in the central part of the state, and one in the south. You could also, again, select a small number of relatively large cities to act as hubs. And I chose a small-sized city to count as a relatively large-sized city because I did not want it to focus simply on the Bay Area and Southern California, LA, San Diego, Riverside. But select a handful of these and then operate with some sort of a radius around, a 30 or 50-mile radius around each of these for the rural recruitment. So again, we open it up for discussion. Our recommendation is to recruit statewide, but we're very open to feedback and modifying that recommendation.
All right, and at this point, I think it'd be good, besides members of the task force, if there's any members of the public in the audience here today that would like to weigh in on that as well. I mean, I never contemplate anything but statewide, but seems to make sense. All right, let's keep going.
Do you have a comment?
Process of recruitment will be dynamic, so we can say it's statewide and then focus on rural areas if we have an excess of early urban volunteers. So it seems to me more that we should emphasize the process than the geographic definition. We want it to be representative, but we don't know yet whether we'll have ample volunteers from some of the sectors.
Well, let's get into the next item with Travis is going to be distribution, and I think we can address that there, Marty. Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Okay. And that takes us to the how many should there be, and that leads into the matrix.
Travis, who's going to do the distribution piece?
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, where we are in the agenda, I believe, is that the next item, which is item 14, is not actually the matrix, but given the amount of time, there may be an opportunity to begin the matrix and push the following item till later.
No, I think you've got time. I mean, I think if members of the committee want to break earlier for lunch, we can. How much time do you think this next item will take?
The accommodations question, item 14 is slated for in the neighborhood of 30 minutes. It's a discussion. It's your discussion, actually. The matrix will
let's do that. Let's see if we can't do that, and then we'll break for lunch, and we'll come back with item 15, where we'll get into the action items, making the actual policy decisions. So let's go to number 14 then, and Jeff, we'll have you present from the podium. So again, this is policy considerations, the non-mileage-based road charge accommodations, and one of my favorite topics.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. This next item, you may remember from the last meeting, it's really an extension of a discussion that you had earlier on what other considerations could be made either in the pilot or coming out of the pilot after you've collected data and evidence to consider accommodations in a road charging system. Again, this is not, or was not, at least originally teed up as a decision item in the work program. but based on comments received from the last meeting, this is your conversation carried forward. What I'm going to do just in a few slides here is just provide a little bit of context and some information points, and then turn it over to you and just allow you to have the discussion that you had asked for. Quickly reflecting on last month's decisions, you had decided to exempt miles that are driven off of the California's public roadway network. So that's out-of-state miles, off-road miles, and private road miles. So the exemptions that you provided in the road charge pilot program were based on the status of the roadway rather than the status of the driver or the type of vehicle. The question then became, well, what other types of things can we learn from the pilot that might inform future policy decisions or recommendations that the committee might make about other types of exemptions, or, as we've refined the question, accommodations that could be made in a road charge program. Oftentimes, a lot of the time, road charging is portrayed as the solution to the revenue problem, or at least the erosion of revenues over time resulting from advancements in vehicle technology, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Also, sometimes lost in that discussion is that road charging is a stronger return to an equity-based policy, and in this case, it's strictly benefit equity. In other words, the user pays principle. And that is cited, in fact, in Senate Bill 1077. I'll just show you a clip from 1077 to remind you of that. But there's also other types of equity that can be taken into consideration. Clearly, road charging, gas taxes, tolls are based on benefit equity. But the discussion that you wanted to have is, are there other types of equity considerations to take into account? If I could just focus your attention briefly on the diagram to the right, which is vertical equity. If you imagine that everyone is driving the same number of miles in the same vehicle, then gas taxes are most like, I believe, proportional equity, where the tax rate is the same regardless of what income level you are in. However, with the advent of the new vehicle technologies and fuel efficiency, the effective tax rate varies based on the type of vehicle that the owner is driving. So what's happened is that we are sliding down towards a regressive tax structure as applied with the gas tax. Now, it's not as dramatic, obviously, as shown in the slide here. That's just to illustrate the concept of a different measure of equity, that's something other than benefit equity. Another point of information for you, this is a snapshot of, with available data that we could find from AAA and other sources, the amount per mile that Californians pay to drive on California's public roadway network. So what you'll see there is about 47.2 cents per mile is the operating costs. That does not take into consideration the purchase price of your vehicle or depreciation or anything like that. This is just what it costs on average to drive a mile in California. Of that, the current fuel tax, and by the way, this is federal and state, so that's why it's a little bit high, is about 2.4 cents per mile. So that's the slice that we're really looking at. So it's about roughly 5% of the operating cost to drive in California is state and federal fuel taxes.
Is this an overall state average, or is this a kind of a typical driver?
It's a typical driver because it's based on a presumed number of miles.
Okay.
Senate Bill 1077 had some provisions in it that you could read into it. In fact, we have read into it, pose some bookends in terms of what the committee, at least this committee right now, is able to do with regard to varying the underlying tax policy of the road charge pilot. The first provision that's informative is that road charging is a policy where drivers pay the same rate per mile driven regardless of the roadway that they're on. So, in other words, that doesn't appear to give us, the committee, much latitude to experiment with the underlying tax policy. However, it does recognize that the road charge itself is a mechanism, this is the second bullet, where it's an equity policy in effect because it has the ability to minimize the impact of the current gas tax structure, which is trending toward regressivity. Here's just a quick illustration for you of the benefit equity principle, the user pays principle, if you will, how it works right now in this illustration with regard to the fuel tax, and then in the next slide we're going to show you how it would work with the hypothetical road charge in California. First of all, there are the two vehicles. The two subject vehicles are an older Ford Taurus, which is somewhat equivalent in terms of capacity, to a new Ford Fusion, which is a high fuel efficiency vehicle. And if these two vehicles were to drive 200 miles, which is roughly a week's worth of driving, what they would pay in fuel, just straight fuel, commodity cost of fuel, X tax, and then what the resulting amounts would be in the gas tax. So if you're driving an 18 mpg vehicle, 200 miles, you're contributing about $3.33 via the California gas tax to your roadway network. By contrast, if you're driving a Ford Fusion at 42 mpg, your contribution via the California gas tax is about $1.43. So those are the effects of the current system as we have it. Road charging, turning the slide, the next page, what that does is it equalizes it so that every vehicle is paying, or at least these two vehicles are paying the same amount for the same number of miles driven. So in the upper example, the less fuel efficient vehicle of 18 mpg is now paying $3 in this hypothetical road charge. We chose 1.5 cents. That's what Oregon's using, and obviously that needs to be finalized later as to what charge would be applied, but this one is we're using for the illustration purposes. And then the Ford Fusion, of course, is now paying more. It's paying $3 for that same distance traveled, just like the 18 mile per gallon vehicle. And the effect is that it's paying more in road charges, or actually roadway charges, than it was under the gas tax. But as you can see, the fuel is still substantially less than what the older vehicle is paying. So in a nutshell, that's what the difference is between the two. As I mentioned, Senate Bill 1077 has some bookends and constraints on what can be experimented with in the pilot in terms of the tax policy. And what we mean by tax policy are the types of exemptions and whether or not there would be differential rates or credits or caps, at least for purposes of the pilot project. And there's some examples of what we mean by these things, such as credits and caps. However, it is not prescriptive on what accommodations can be made. So as the pilot project gathers data, in other words, once we learn more about who's driving that MPG, that 18 mpg vehicle, and who's driving the 42 mpg vehicle, where do they live, what are the effects, then as an outcome, potential outcome, if you decide, you could start to think about in a final report different types of accommodations that could be explored in the future as a recommendation to CalSTA or the legislature. And by accommodation, we're really talking about methods to make the payment easier for whatever population that you found through the pilot project might need some assistance in complying with or contributing their share to the road charge. So things such as level payment plans, it's done in the utility industry. Infrequent driver plans, I guess in this case it's actually the vehicle. We have trip permit systems for vehicles that really only need to be registered a minimum amount per year, or even transit passes sometimes offer transit ticks, day passes that you can buy in a block and tear off and use only as you need to use them. Those are the types of things that we mean when we're talking about accommodations rather than the underlying tax rates or policy. The final slide, and then we'll turn it over for your discussion, is it has been suggested that perhaps a time permit, at least for certain population groups, lower income populations, that might be more appealing than some of the more technology-dependent operational concepts that will be offered in the pilot project. So if we are offering a time permit to drivers, imagine for this example that it's an annual permit, from the state side of things, you would want to set the policy, in other words, your charge per year at at a rate, a number of miles driven, so that you can effectively discourage people from gaming the system. So you're not offering, a permit priced at, an average of 9,000 miles, and then having everyone who's traveling lots and lots of miles in California underpaying their amount. So just for your information, Oregon has identified the 98th percentile in terms of number of miles driven as their price point where they would like to set their time permit. So when you imagine then a driver, perhaps a low-income driver or someone that's accustomed to pay-as-you-go methods, showing up to acquire their annual time permit so that they don't have to worry about any of the technology gadgets. In the Oregon system, that would be priced at the 98th percentile, and the cost, if it was paid all at once at 1.5 cents, which is Oregon's amount, would be $525 in this example. So those are the points of information that we have for you. This was the discussion that you wanted to have. There is a staff recommendation on this, which we'll get to later, but it does not delve into changing the underlying tax policy or the types of accommodations. So basically, we're turning the canvas over to you for the discussion.
Could I just ask a question? When you say the 98th percentile, that means that they sell a time permit that is no less than the 98th percentile? That you must buy at that level?
That's correct.
Thanks. And do they break it down so you can buy it less in a time increment less than an annual?
Right now, I'm not aware of any plans that they have in the initial rollout to do that. And I'd like to. No, okay, that's confirmed.
So you can only buy an annual permit, and you can only buy it at the 98th percentile.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
And I think, and I appreciate the review on this, Jeff. I think the thing that, when I talk to people about this, and one of the things I would like the task force to consider is that, and again, this is going to be a transitory effort. This road charge thing is going to, if you can think forward 20 years, which is not that far from now, it's probably going to be a much different situation than we're talking today. It's probably going to be, speaking of 98%, it's probably going to be 98% technology-based as the fleet changes over time. But the fleet doesn't change that fast. It usually, as we've heard in our meetings, it takes time. For some people own their cars 20, 30 years. Some people never will change on their vehicle. But as new vehicles come out and we come up with standards, that'll make it different. But what I think we need to think about also is how can we address this paper option that makes it as simple for the road user as possible. And to me, it's been, when we look at the various categories that we've discussed, or classes of vehicles, I think we have, 3 is the number we're looking at? Is that the number that we've talked about, I think? And the one that's the most common is the light passenger and light truck, or passenger vehicle and light truck, which I think is 6,000 pounds or less, which I believe was the overwhelming majority of vehicles on the road in California. Again, my privacy instructor, Lee TM here, it gets to the issue of how can a driver be able to buy something as simple as, the miles, if their average miles are 12,000 miles a year, and we've determined that's the average, then you ought to be able to buy that pass. And I think that should be an accommodation that we should have beyond all of the falderall that we hear about in terms of technology in this. And again, as I said at the onset of my comments, I think what Oregon has done in trailblazing is very laudable. But if we're going to be successful in California, and frankly, if this process will be successful around the country, we're going to need to have something that's as simple as you don't even know it's happening, to being able to just, for privacy purposes, being able to buy your miles and move on, and no more gas tax. I mean, it's those pieces together. Supervisor?
In our effort to keep it simple, I still think we need to, when you go to slide 52, I think we still need to charge for those miles. Because the only reason I think we shouldn't charge would be, or to give a credit, would be if you're driving on a toll lane where part of the toll is expressly used to maintain that toll lane. Otherwise, it just gets to be so confusing. If you're talking about a time permit and someone's got a 20,000 mile-driven time permit for $300, but they're saying, well, half of that miles, it's really on private roads, therefore, do I pay $150? And then if you've got the odometer reading data collection method, if you're driving around on the highways and you enter into a private development, you have to keep track of the miles within the private development, so you subtract that from your total odometer reading to get your credit. So it just gets to be very confusing, and then it becomes a very manual process, and it's prone to human error or cheating. So I think we want to keep it simple. And like I said before, you don't get a credit right now on your gas tax if you drive on private roads. You're still paying, the gas tax to the state of California. So I just think we need to take a look at all the methods, and if we want to talk about all these different credits for the private roads and off-road miles and such, I think we're really complicating the process, and right now we don't get credit for those items.
Richard?
Thank you. I tend to agree with that, and the one, for instance, we all pay taxes for public schools, whether or not our kids go to public schools, so that makes sense to me. I do think that the one, I don't know a lot about private roads, but I know that this would be a big issue, I think, for Native tribes, and maybe what we should be talking about, and I know it doesn't exactly come into the pilot stage, but maybe we should talk about making sure that money that's generated driving on those roads is going back to maintain those roads somehow. So that's something that maybe we could talk about. I'd also, though, like to get back to the time permit. I think I may be understanding this differently than what I've heard from some comments. I think the way I'm understanding it is that in Oregon, they want to make sure that if you buy a time permit, you're not going to be incentivized to drive more than you otherwise would. And so they're going to charge everybody who wants a time permit as though they're going to drive 35,000 miles a year. And I think that we have a balance to make relative to this agenda item between not wanting to encourage excessive driving on the one hand, but also we have data now that indicates that low-income households drive significantly less. And so I think an accommodation that we really should be looking at is some way to provide a lower-cost time permit for households based on income, because we know that they're already contributing less to greenhouse gas emissions, to traffic congestion, to all these social ills, and they would be paying for the benefit that they're getting anyway. So I think that's what we should be doing.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to go back and talk about the exemptions. Right now, agriculture doesn't pay sales tax on fuel. So for the use of private roads, that would be punitive, for agriculture. And there's a lot of private roads that are used right now. So just wanted to bring that up.
That's a good point.
And I think we could carve out classes of drivers, so agricultural use might be a carve-out in that.
Any other questions? How about members of the public? Anybody want to weigh in? The audience? Got somebody in the back? Come on up. Get you to fill out a speaker slip, and while you're doing that, we'll turn to Lauren Kay.
I think there's some really good values that we're discussing here in terms of trade-offs, and as I said earlier, I'm a big fan of simplicity. But my ordering principle on whatever our euphemism is here, accommodations, my ordering principle is that we keep this as close to a user benefit as possible. And the reason for that, and then I have ways I think of dealing with these other issues, but by keeping it as close to a user benefit as possible, I think that we'll be able to keep the money within the system. And what I'm very concerned about is having a fee or a tax or whatever it winds up being that is raised for the putative purpose of maintaining the roads and highways and bridges, and in effect replacing the gas tax, but doesn't have the same expenditure protections that the Article 19 money has, because this is a different animal. If it's a benefit fee, then under a different part of the Constitution, it is protected, and it can only be used for the purposes for which it's raised. And this is and if you've seen the way that our friends in the Capitol have, gone about dealing with some of the very legitimate and hard issues they've dealt with over the years, then you can understand why this might be an issue. So, again, my ordering principle is to start with it being as close to a benefit as possible, and then, I would suggest that be the recommendation, but that you can legislatively, without necessarily doing damage to the benefit principle, you can legislatively have, what are in effect side deals that recognize that there may be certain aspects of regressivity to this fee, which is true for the gas tax as well. But the gas tax was never overtly recognized in the gas tax. You didn't take a card and give it to your service station attendant and get a discount. You didn't get a rebate on your income tax. But there are ways of making these side deals that I think can maintain the integrity of this as a user fee, but also if we, or more especially the legislature, believes that there's some aspects of regressivity that should be addressed, then they can do it in ways that honor that. And frankly, the same I think is true with certain aspects of off-road use. There's clearly vehicles that are dedicated to agricultural or forestry uses that are mostly on or in large part on private roads. That is a key element of user payment. The user is not the driver is not using the public roads when they're not on the public roads. I live on a private road in Sacramento County. I drive an average of 3/4 of a mile a day on that private road. I would be embarrassed to ask for a rebate, and I think that there are not so many large-scale private developments where I think that's going to impinge it. But there are legitimate areas where that comes into play. So anyway, that's a little bit long-winded way of saying that where I'm looking at this from the perspective of a user fee, but with some recognition and some discussion about how we can perhaps accommodate other values without violating the integrity of that as a user fee. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. I always think about folks that are on ranches and driving around, and if we're going to transition 100% to this thing, I guess I'm driving around on my own roads, I don't frankly want to pay if I don't have to. So those are those issues, and I would imagine Andrea Fox from the California Farm Bureau might have a thing or two to say about that. Welcome.
I just have some brief comments. First of all, I want to say I really appreciate the very open and honest and discussion here, the willingness to consider all the different aspects of our very diverse state from one end to the other. I mean, we're not all urban, we're not all rural, it's quite a combination. For farmers and ranchers, of course, they drive a lot of miles, like you said, on their ranches, around their farms, up and down roads that are not state highways. So they put a lot of miles on, and most often, larger vehicles. And these vehicles are their big pickups, especially when you are dealing with a ranch where you're pulling trailers and you're hauling a lot of stuff for your business, these vehicles are also their private vehicles. And so they will transition very quickly into using it to go into town, which could be quite a distance away. And so I really do want to urge consideration of that, because we are the agricultural state in the United States, and we supply fresh produce, fiber, you name it, to the rest of the country as well as the world. And so there, consideration really is really important to us. Again, I want to thank you for your very careful consideration of all of this, and I guess that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for being here. And I think to her point, and again, as you hear me and the tech geek in me will talk about, I think as you go into the future, 10 years, which probably won't even be that long, but those farm vehicles, they'll have built-in telematics that will, without even the farmer or the driver knowing about it, while they're riding around doing the work on the farm, the clicker's not clicking. As soon as they drive off onto a publicly financed road, the clicker starts clicking. It's up to them whether or not time and place gets reported, which gets back to the privacy issues. But I think those are the things, that's in the future. We've got to figure out what can we do right now and how can that work as well. And I see somebody else's hand is up, so Adrian, if you would be kind enough to also fill out a form just so we have you for the record, but come on up to the microphone.
Good morning. I'm Adrian Moore. I'm representing both the Reason Foundation and the Mileage-Based User Fee Alliance, which is a national nonprofit organization of groups that are looking at road usage charge. We just used an older name for it.
We got rid of the U. We just call it road
right.
charge.
Changing the name once you've incorporated is too hard. So. I think when you're thinking about these accommodations, one thing that's easy to lose sight of, and that I've seen in other settings, it's easy to lose sight of, that we're talking about a fee that's replacing the gas tax. So many of these issues that are being brought up are just, if not more applicable to the fuel tax than they would be to a road usage charge. And so you don't need to torture the design of this system in order to make accommodations that weren't made with the fuel tax necessarily. So in the case of a lot of now with agricultural exempt fuel, we have an exemption there, and you're going to want to accommodate that. But just the fact that people drive further in rural areas, well, they're already paying more in fuel taxes to drive further because they're using more gas for every additional mile they drive. If they're paying additional mileage charge, there is not necessarily any equity impact there. So every time you're thinking about accommodations, think about it in the context of compared to what, which is the system that we already have. And I forget who brought up, in Orange County you have a lot of toll roads. Well, we're not making special accommodations to compensate the people who pay fuel taxes in Orange County who also use the toll roads. So if we replace the gas tax with the mileage charge, it's not obvious that we need to then make accommodations for the mileage charge when we didn't make accommodations for the gas tax. So we might, but it's just not obvious that you need to just because we're shifting to a new mechanism. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian. All right, any other comments? Lee?
Just one more comment. I mean, we are talking about a pilot. So, I guess I'm curious, is there a way to do to the extent that we have questions about the prudence of particular additional accommodations or exemptions, is that something that's actually testable within the pilot project? Is there anything that we need to know, or is it purely just sort of what's the right, what value priorities are there? I'm curious if there's anything to be gained. I mean, because I think one of the things that's potentially empirical, for instance, is the setting of prices for the time permit, right? We are talked about how you might attempt to build in an adverse selection / moral hazard sort of premium to the time permit because you expect cheating. I'm always very skeptical about adverse selection arguments. I mean, I think that American law and economics people go way too far in trying to use that as a factor. But, is there some way you can empirically gauge whether or not there's going to be more cheating or more consumption of miles on a time-based permit than not? Because that's actually sort of the question. If there isn't, then you don't need to charge an extra a premium.
Any other questions or comments? This probably gives us a good point to break for lunch, and then we can come back with some policy decisions based on some of the things. And clearly, again, as you all know, with this task force, things that we have voted on before are always subject to change, and the same thing with today as we continue to learn more. So in looking at the agenda, we have done remarkably well in terms of things. We'll be coming back to our action items, which is item 15 on the agenda, and our actual policy decisions, which are typically near the end of the day. It is 11:40 a.m. right now. Is everybody okay with reconvening in an hour and 20 minutes at 1 p.m.? Does that work good? Give us a little bit extra time. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kempton to give us a rundown of some potential places for fine dining here in Sacramento.
I know many of you